Hello, Big Bass fans, and welcome to the Big Bass Podcast. My name is Ken Duke.
And I'm Terry Battisti. And our producer, engineer, the guy that does all the work behind the scenes is Nathan Benson. The title of this episode is simply Orgs. And it's all about the organizations that keep fishing records.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the organizations that keep international records, that keep national records, even a lot of the state records here in the U.S. Some of these organizations do a pretty good job. We got to give them some credit, but some, maybe not so much.
Yeah, and beyond that, we're going to go into some of the quirky rules that these organizations and states and even sometimes lakes have with respect to how do you document a record fish. It's going to be pretty interesting to see how, many anglers have been screwed out of records for not doing something weird the right way. So that's what we're going to get into.
We also want to make sure that everybody watching and listening will be able to avoid some of these pitfalls, because sometimes guys have lost records not because of anything they did or through any real meaningful fault of their own, but because the record-keeping organizations got a little bit screwy on them. And, Terry, in putting this show together and thinking about the record-keeping organizations out there, one of the first questions that sort of occurred to me was, well, just who the hell do they think they are? That they suddenly decide they are the anointed ones. They are the chosen one. They're the one who are going to keep the records for all mankind and fish kind. And that sort of struck me. And what I learned was there are no different, no better, no more authoritative, really, than you and I in the Big Bass Podcast.
No, I mean, there's a lot to it. I mean, we'll have one example that we'll get into in a bit. It kind of fell in their lap, right? And I don't think that this organization or actually company ever intended, but it just so happened that they had a ton of data and they became the keepers just essentially by default, right? But
that's exactly right. We'll get into that in just a moment. As a matter of fact, leading up to that, one of the earliest references I can find to any organization calling something World Records of Fishing was in this book. This is the 1926 edition of the World Almanac and Book of Facts. 1926. And if you look on page 712, Terry, you will learn right down here at the bottom somewhere that Fritz Friebel of Florida has a world record for largemouth bass. That fish weighed 20 pounds, 2 ounces. And it's the world record. Not because you or I or any duly elected group decided so, but because the world record, the World Almanac and Book of Facts decided it was so.
You never cease to amaze me. I mean, so how did you find that record in that book?
To be honest, I can't recall. But I found some. I was researching Fritz Friebel, who, of course, caught a 20-pound, 2-ounce largemouth bass in the Tampa area of Florida back in 1923. And I saw a reference to this book. All it said was that Friebel was mentioned in here. He was listed as having some sort of record in this book. So, by God, I've got to have it. And if it's a fishing text, if it's a fishing piece of memorabilia, it means two things. One, I really need to have it. And two, I've got to beat Terry Battisti out of it.
Yeah, so you paid, probably $4 for that thing. And now when I go to buy it, it's going to cost $200 because you've mentioned it on the Big Bass Podcast. And now that's increased the value of that thing. So thank you, Ken Duke, for, screwing me again. The first time that he did this was I was bidding on the first issue of the Lunker Hole magazine from, I believe it was May of 1974. and it would literally started out, the bid was like $4 or something like that. And after if you're smart about eBay, you don't make your bids until the last 5 minutes of the auction. And in the last 5 minutes of the auction, I lost the bid, and I ended up losing it at $70. And the first thing I did is I called Ken Duke and said, "Are you the expletive that outbid me on the Lunker Hole magazine?" And he said, "Yes." So now we consult each other so we don't pay too much money for something.
Whenever one of us loses a bid on eBay for some really cool but very obscure piece of bass memorabilia, we know who got it. We know who beat us out. And there's usually a phone call. And sometimes we say, "Hey, I didn't even know it was there. I wish I had. I would have bid on it." But yeah. Terry made me overpay for that particular magazine by a factor of about 20. So thanks, Terry. I got the magazine. And, of course, what is the first thing I do? Or what is the first thing Terry does? He calls me and says, "Oh, you won it. Oh, I can't believe you did that. I can't believe you beat me out of that, you bastard." What
guilt him. I guilt him.
Would you scan it for me? So, yeah, I scanned it and
sent it to me.
So now he's got the thing, and I paid $70 for it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the World Almanac and Book of Facts shows up, and that's 1926. Just about the earliest record I can find of somebody calling it a world record, a world's record. So it's kind of a big deal.
How many records did they have in there? Was it?
Good question. Not a lot. They don't even have a smallmouth. The only bass record they have is largemouth. They've got probably, looks like about 20. They've got
saltwater and freshwater,
largemouths, trout. Sorry, this is fresh and salt because they've got tarpon in here.
Yeah.
They've got muskie in here. They've got bluefish in here, channel bass, so a lot of saltwater fish too. It's a very short list, but that's what's available in 1926.
All right, cool.
And of course, from that we devolve into other people calling things records. And really, we have a lot to owe to Field and Stream magazine, Terry, because in about 1910, 1911, Field and Stream introduced their Big Fish contest. And it covered a multitude of species, but for our purposes, what we care about, of course, is it covered largemouth and smallmouth bass. And at some point, they divided largemouth bass into southern largemouth bass, which mainly meant Florida, and other largemouth bass, which is pretty much everywhere but Florida.
Right.
And it was really from those early Field and Stream issues that publications like the World Almanac and Book of Facts pulled that information and decided, hey, whatever were the biggest fish entered in those contests from 1910 to wherever we are now, that's got to be the world record, right? And so that's what they were called. But those were kind of national records, and those came along early. But let's start with the highest scope. Let's start with the broadest, widest scope, and that would be international fishing records. Mm-hmm. And the first organization I know of that started international fishing records, which were exclusively saltwater, was, of course, the International Game Fish Association, or as we call in shorthand, IGFA.
Yep.
They started back in 1939. Mm-hmm. And Terry, I want to get your take on this, but I have to grudgingly say they're probably the most respected, the most revered, maybe the most serious of all the record-keeping organizations out there.
Yeah, there's no argument with that. And there's another project that I'm working on that was keeping records before then, saltwater-wise, and that was the Catalina Tuna Club.
Right. And of course, that we talk about the Tuna Club. Zane Grey started the Tuna Club back in the day in California, and it's still in existence.
Well, he was one of the charter members.
Organization. Right.
Zane Grey was one of the charter members.
The Tuna Club was part of the genesis of IGFA in 1939. So their tentacles, their roots go a long way in a lot of different directions.
Right. Yeah. So, but when it comes to the standards of which all anglers, are held accountable with respect to record fish, the IGFA is the pinnacle. They are the authority, but at the time it was only saltwater, right?
Right. And for IGFA, it was only saltwater until 1978. We'll get to that in just a moment. But one of the issues with IGFA, at least in my mind, is that IGFA, we can say they were all about saltwater from their inception in 1939 until 1978. But I think it's arguable that they're still really all about saltwater, and they've never really put a lot of emphasis on their freshwater efforts. And I've gotten in some hot water and stirred the pot a little bit, maybe more than I should have, with IGFA in that regard. But I've got my arguments too.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the people that have been awarded awards from IGFA, and it's magnitudes of order more saltwater fishermen have received awards. And I'm not talking about records. I'm talking about awards.
Hall of Fame honors and things like that.
Hall of Fame honors and stuff like that. It's 90%. It's easy 90%, saltwater people.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And whereas to get in, there are organizations that honor bass fishermen. There's the Bass Fishing Hall of Fame, where you have to either die or be on the board of directors to get in. But don't get me started on that. Obviously, that's a thing. But my gripe with IGFA is probably best exemplified by this book, which was their self-commissioned, self-published history book, Big Game Fishing Headquarters. A history of the IGFA. Now, this book was published in 2005. And in the entire 232-page book, they mention one freshwater fish. One! And they mention it on page 220. And they're talking about disqualifying the David Hayes smallmouth record and instituting another fish in its place. The irony is that later that very same year, they would reinstate David Hayes because
how did that happen?
We're going to save that for another episode too. Battisti wants to give up every episode of the Big Bass Podcast in one episode. Battisti wants to do like a 300-hour episode. I'm trying to keep these bite-sized.
Anyway.
But yeah. So there's not a lot of regard or respect for freshwater fish in that publication, and I wish there was. But let's wander back, if we will, for just a moment to Field and Stream, which really started the freshwater fishing records when they started their big fish contest in around 1910, 1911. They ran it until 1977. That's in 1978. They handed off their records to IGFA. So everything that Field and Stream maintained is now handled by IGFA.
Right, and that's what I was alluding to earlier, in that, here Field and Stream has this, big fish contest. It's open to anybody that submits a fish. They had some, I think in 1910 they had like 14 rules that you had to go by. And of course, that over the years, it expanded to certain things that you had to do to qualify your fish. Obviously, the first few years, you didn't have to submit a picture because it was harder than hell to get a picture taken in 1910.
I believe they did require a cave drawing, though.
Okay, yeah, petroglyph or something like that. But here they are having this fish contest, and what evolved out of a probably a contest that would get them more people subscribing to the magazine. Which would in turn get them more ads revenue for them. It kind of fell into their lap as them being the holder of all these records. So,
a great point. This was a marketing play. This is absolutely a marketing play on their part. They thought, hey, we're going to host a big fish contest. We're going to draw in some new readers for that. We're going to draw in some new subscribers for that. We're going to pull in some advertisers and sponsors for that. It's just a good marketing play. And it was. And it worked for them for almost 70 years before it became maybe just a little more burdensome than they needed it to be because of the world record element of it all. But they first published a world record list in 1928. And for what it's worth, they said that the world record largemouth bass, as of 1928, was a fish caught by George J. Nichols just a couple of years earlier from the Tombigbee River in Alabama, weighing 24 pounds. We're going to go into that fish later, but don't worry about it. Although the fish did weigh 24 pounds, it was not a largemouth bass. They said that the world record smallmouth was 9 pounds, 4 ounces, caught by William Shoemaker out of Long Lake, Michigan. So the earliest publication we've got showing world record status for bass is 24 even, far exceeding what we have now as a world record, ironically, and 9 1/4, which is far less than our current world
record. And the interesting thing is I've actually fished Long Lake, and it's back in the mid-'80s, it had some big smallmouth in it. So, I mean, a 9.4, totally believable out of Long Lake. So
a 24 out of the Tombigbee Waterway in Alabama? Not so much.
No. No,
but
not going to go there.
One of the reasons they were able to get a lot of big fish recognition in Field and Stream from 1910 through 1977 was this was a contest. There were prizes. If you were awarded big bass, big muskie, big pike, big rainbow trout, whatever it might be, you were going to win prizes. And so that was very attractive, especially in an era like the late 1920s and 1930s when George Perry was entering and winning. That was the Great Depression. And what might have been a $75 prize then was well over $1,000 by today's standards.
Yeah, it was a big deal. I mean, you'd get a rod, you get a reel, tackle box filled with some head lures or creek chub lures or whatever. I mean, it was a huge deal.
Absolutely, it was. And anytime you have a contest, you gotta. I hate to say it, but I think that you gotta expect a certain amount of fraud, like George J. Nichols with his 24-pound fish. And so that's the drawback of having a contest, making it something where there's a financial reward for winning, irrespective of what the merits might show. On a national level, so you've got Field and Stream issuing world records on a national level. They're calling world records, but really they were just U.S. records. And then, of course, Field and Stream hands it off to IGFA in 1978. In the meantime, in 1974, you have an organization which at the time called themselves the National Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame. Now they're known as the Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame. They started keeping freshwater records beginning in 1974. And they were kind of in competition a bit with Field and Stream. Maybe they sensed that Field and Stream was waning, that Field and Stream realized that the toll the world records were taking on staffing and things like that were a little more than they wanted to deal with. And so they were going to be getting out of that business pretty soon. But the National Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame comes along, and in 74 they start becoming a record keeper, and they take a little snarky shot at Field and Stream. And it's still on their website today. They say, prior to this date, prior to 1974, the only far-reaching program was a national magazine's annual fishing contest. Because this was primarily a contest, the rules and qualifying system were not as stringent as an increasing, sophisticated, and demanding sport fishing public needed. Enter the hall. I feel like I should put the paren, the Latin phrase SIC, close paren, to reflect the fact that their grammar ain't that good. But
well, then not only that, they accept a fish in what was it, 2005 that had farce written all over it. I mean,
yeah, in the late 80s they did it, in the 90s they did it. They've not done the greatest job of carrying the torch for record-keeping organizations, and they're still out there. They're still publishing a record book every year. As a matter of fact, here's one of their more recent issues.
Did you pay for that?
Well, I'm a member. I've been a member a long time, and I treasure my membership in the Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame because I do pay close attention to what they're doing in the record-keeping world, just as I pay my dues every year to IGFA because it's a big deal in my world. I've been a member for 20 plus years of both those organizations, and I would not dare let them lapse. I want to see what they're doing, even if sometimes I'm laughing at what they're doing.
No.
In 93, the Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame expanded their program to add catch and release records. Unlike Field and Stream. What's that, Terry?
IGFA wasn't doing it at that time either. I mean, so you got to give them credit for some forward thinking. You know, they're trying to support catch and release. You know, I mean, so I my hat's off to them for doing that.
And both those organizations have also started to recognize line class records. You know, 2 pound, 4 pound, 6 pound line, and so on, because that gets, you know, the more awards you have, the more prizes you can give out, the better it is. The more people stay interested in it, the more people see an opportunity to participate. So that becomes kind of a big deal, and they like to do it. Whereas IGFA, coming out of the saltwater world, has always had a certain perspective on their rules and regulations. The National Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame has had a little different take on things. For example, with the National Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame, it's permissible for an angler to be assisted in landing the fish. Now, they don't really spell out what that means, Terry, but let's offer an example here, and I think it falls within the parameters of what they would allow. If Terry Battisti hooks a fish and then hands the rod to me,
I'd never do that.
No matter how much I beg, by the way, and I wind the fish in and land the fish, that's okay, according to the Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame. But they will only recognize one of us as the record holder. Also, what I think is very interesting about the Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame is they make no distinction between public and private water. You know, you can catch a world record in Lake Okeechobee or Sam Rayburn or Lake Erie, or you can catch a world record on a private lake.
What about a hatchery?
They don't make a distinction about a hatchery. Yeah. IGFA's regulations are, I would say, a little more stringent. For example, IGFA prohibits a world record coming from a private, a club or hatchery waters, or private ponds that are not accessible to the general public. Anything where there's a fee or the public is allowed, that's going to be okay. And they also say there's a case-by-case basis. They're going to want to take a closer look if a record comes out of kind of sketchy conditions like that.
That's interesting because I I know of someone in, I believe, Alabama that is trying to raise a world record copper-nosed bluegill.
Is that right?
I wonder if this person knows, out of a private pond, I wonder if this person knows that fish would not be legal if caught.
Yeah, they'd at least have an uphill battle with IGFA. At least an uphill battle. IGFA has a rule against an angler being assisted during the catch. IGFA, if I'm fighting a fish and Terry reaches over and grabs the rod for just a moment to give me a break to reposition myself or something,
DQ.
No record. DQ'd immediately. Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame, that's still potentially a legitimate catch. Power-driven reels are not allowed in IGFA. So an electric reel, which are used by a number of handicapped anglers, no good with IGFA, apparently permissible with the Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame. So there's differences in the rules. And that's important because sometimes, and that's why some records exist with one of the organizations but not the other. And then, Terry, you really open up the can of worms when you get down to the state regulations. Because the bass is in 49 states. And in fact, a few years ago, a bass was actually caught in Alaska. So now a bass has been caught in all 50 states.
Wait a minute. When did that happen?
A few years ago, a guy caught a really worn-out, rugged-looking bass in Alaska that weighed less than 2 pounds.
So, in other words, it was driven up the Alcan Highway, right?
I think you might be able to say that fish looked. Maybe you could say that fish looked pretty good since it came from like Wisconsin or someplace. But anyway,
or Washington
was caught allegedly in Alaska.
Oh,
but you get down to the state level, and things really get quirky.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, I am happy to say that I came from a state that took it seriously. They had biologists that would literally within an hour or two would show up at the lake if you caught a fish that was a record. And I'm not just talking a state record fish. I'm talking a lake record fish. It was
folks, Terry's from Hawthorne, California. Grew up in California.
Born in Hawthorne.
Okay, he's from California. And he grew up in that.
How did you know I was born in Hawthorne? Are you part of the OMB breach of security information?
This is not just parking. Terry grew up in the midst of that big bass boom that occurred in California beginning in the late 1960s and early 70s. He worked in that community. His first jobs while still in high school were in tackle shops that were in the middle of all that. So I envy him that. Whereas I had to come from, poor Central Florida, which really was the origin of everything having to do with big bass. But Terry, let's talk about some of the quirky state rules and regulations for getting a record done. And one of the things that really, really interests me, really fascinates me, really concerns me about some of these records, even at the state level, are the states that take into consideration whether or not they will recognize a fish that came out of totally private water.
And I understand that, and on one hand, I agree with it, because you can have someone that's, got a private water, they've stocked it, they've done all the right things with respect to harvest in order to grow, like Ray's Lake, right?
Legacy Lakes down in Pensacola, Alabama, sure.
Ray was, I don't know that he was trying to raise a world record, but he wanted to catch 10 pounders. He wanted to catch big fish, and he hired the best biologist in the South to run it for him. But what if you've got a club that has a lake? Like there's a lake out in Southern California called Oso Reservoir. And it used to be you had to pay a membership to go there. And if you had the membership, then you got to fish. If that lake produced a world record in California, it would probably hold. But with IGFA, it wouldn't. And they weren't doing anything special. They just had a 80-acre lake that they managed well. In that sense, I don't agree with it.
This is one of those areas where I think hunting has it all over us in the fishing world. I haven't been a serious hunter in a long time, but in the world of hunting with firearms and hunting with bows, there are organizations like Boone and Crockett, there are organizations Pope and Young that have concepts of they call it fair chase. Mm-hmm. And those fair chase rules resonate with me. And it covers stuff like living inside a high fence. If an animal is shot inside a high fence, it can't be given Boone and Crockett or Pope and Young honors. Mm-hmm. If an animal is pursued by a drone or something like that, it can't be considered for Pope and Young or Boone and Crockett honors. I wish that the fishing organizations, whether it be state, regional, national, or international, would all consider that, because I think that's important. There are companies, there are people who are trying to grow record fish in private water. And I have concerns or issues with whether or not those should be given record status.
And I agree with that. I agree with that. But to have a 200 or a 300 acre or even 1,000 acre lake that is owned by a club and they're not doing anything special, but a big fish or a record fish comes out of it, in that case, I think they should be considered. So, I mean, if you can document that you're not doing anything special, i.e. putting special hybrid fish in or yada, 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 that should be a no in my eyes.
And that's really interesting that you mention those kind of parameters, because I am a geek about big fish and stuff like that, as is Dr. Battisti. I dug into that recently, Terry, and let's go through some of the quirky state regulations, because they tell an interesting story. And before we dig into the specifics of some of the states, we're not going to cover all of them, but there are certain usual regulations that states and even the IGFA and the Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame adhere to. And those are things like you got to weigh the fish on certified scales. You got to have witnesses. You might need a state biologist to come out there and certify that it's the proper species. You got to take photographs of the fish. You got to take measurements of the fish. The fish has got to be caught in a sporting manner. Stuff like that. Those are really standard. Those are very ordinary. We're not concerned about those, because you better anticipate those if you're hoping and dreaming and planning to catch a record class fish. But let's cover some of the quirky stuff, and let's also dig into the private water yes, private water no question. And let's do them alphabetically, Terry.
All right.
I'll kick it off with Alabama. And the one thing I want to say about Alabama, which is the only distinctive thing they have to say about their regs and records, is that they will allow a fish out of private water.
I wonder how Ray got that changed. I guarantee you, Ray Scott had a lot to do with that. With that,
I never thought about it from that angle, but Ray would be exactly the guy to pull the strings and make sure that Legacy Lake could have a state record.
Exactly.
Very impressive. As soon as we go next in the alphabet,
Arizona.
We're not going to do Alaska because we're not worried about bass in Alaska. But next in the alphabet, except for Alaska, would be Arizona. Private water? No, they don't allow. They would not allow a record catch from private water. And
well, there's no water in Arizona to begin with.
Okay, but you know what? There is There is water in Arkansas. And they
Yes.
also say no hatcheries or pay lakes. They say private waters, and this is a quote, will be considered.
Yeah, and
Will
that
be
gets to my
considered.
point. That gets to the point that I was making earlier. I think that's a good rule.
And your point was that are they doing something to try
Yeah,
to manipulate
yeah.
the fishery?
Absolutely.
Well, that's a very fuzzy line, Dr. Battisti. You know that.
From
It's
a lawyer,
very
yes,
fuzzy
it's
line.
a fuzzy line. You know, so it becomes a battle of the lawyers in court.
Maybe
It's another
so,
way for
maybe
you
so.
to make money, Ken. You guys get into
Terry's
everything.
alluding to my former life as an attorney. That was a long time ago. Now, this one is right in your wheelhouse. If anyone saw our episode on H.W. Ross and his 23-pound, 8-ounce fish from 1884, you saw our conversation about Terry's equation for calculating the weight of a bass based on length and girth measurements. California, which is where Terry was born and where Terry grew up, has a provision in their state record regulations that says length and girth may be used to validate the weight of a fish.
Yeah, and I honestly have not kept up with Cal DFG. And I don't know how long
Cal DFG being the Department of Fish and Game.
Yeah. I don't know how long that rule has been in the books. And I'm not, I mean, I did that formula or that model to discount Leah True's record that we're, going to get into at some point. And it validated that True's fish was not a 20 and a, or 22 and a half pound fish. So I don't want to beat my own drum, but maybe California is using my weight estimation formula. I don't know.
I hope they are.
Because
I mean,
but they can't, because they can't use the standard IGFA model. They can't use the standard 800 model. They can't use the 1300 model. They can't use the 1100 or the 1200 model because they are way out of whack when it comes to predicting the weight within even 5 or 6 pounds in some cases. So what model are they going to use to validate based upon measurement? I don't know. And so I'm going to dig into that. Maybe we'll do a show on that.
They're the only state that says in writing that they consider length and girth measurements as a way to validate fish weight. So I think that's very interesting. They're the lone wolf on that standard.
Yeah, I need to dig into that because that's an outlier.
Next alphabetically, Colorado says public or private is just fine. Georgia. Let's dig down into Georgia for just a moment here. The state that has the current world record, or at least half of the world record, with George Perry's 1932 fish weighing 22 pounds 4 ounces. The other half of the record belonging to Japan's Lake Biwa and Manabu Kurita's 22 pound 5 ounce fish from 2009. Georgia says the fish must be hooked and landed by the entrant. And Georgia has a quirky variation on this public or private thing. Their way of phrasing it is to say that fish that are caught from private waters, which adults of the species are stocked, are not eligible. So
What
as soon
the
as
hell
you
does
stock
that
an
mean?
adult largemouth bass in a body of water, that makes that body of water ineligible to produce a state record fish.
It doesn't make sense.
Welcome to Georgia. Welcome to Georgia.
Oh, that's
Go
weird.
Dogs.
Yeah.
Quirky rule there.
golly.
Here's just a funny one. Just one I got a kick out of, Terry. Indiana. Like most states, they require witnesses, they require certified scales, they require all this stuff. But then they say, for state record fish entries, applicants may wish to consider hiring a photographer.
who's going to know exactly how to make that fish look bigger in a picture.
Exactly. I have no reason for highlighting that particular state here, except that I thought it was interesting. They're recommending that you hire a photographer. So apparently, the photography lobbyists run strong in the state of Indiana.
Yep.
Now, here's a weird one, and that you and I can appreciate as guys who write a lot about bass fishing and so forth. Louisiana, the Louisiana Outdoor Writers Association, officially handles the state records, and they've done so since the 1940s. Okay, they charge a $25 application fee and a $2 service fee. Good news is they accept PayPal because they use this as a fundraiser for the Louisiana Outdoor Writers Association, which I think is kind of funny. But they've been doing it since the 40s, and we're going to get to another state that also lets the Outdoor Writers Association handle records, and that would be Ohio.
So what happens if you slip them $500?
I'm not gonna touch that question, Terry Battisti.
All right,
I'm not gonna touch that question.
Amazing. Like, you're not touching something that's controversial.
Yeah, usually I dive right in. I dive right in. I like
both
that.
feet.
Yeah, exactly. If I can get, how can I get in more trouble? Maryland, another state that does not allow catch from private waters. But Massachusetts, Terry, Massachusetts is really, really squirrely. I mean, in the extreme. I've never seen such squirrely regs as are offered in Massachusetts. And maybe they can afford to do it because their state record largemouth is 15.5, and they know nobody's ever going to touch that. But in Massachusetts, because of COVID and because their mass wildlife offices have been closed due to COVID, if you catch a potential record fish there, you have to present it to a guy named Stephen Maddox. And there's one guy in the entire state who can certify your fish. His name is Stephen Maddox, Mattocks. If you're tracking him down, I can get his email number for you, his email address for you if you need it. But the other thing you need to note is that if you've caught a state record or potential state record, and you're going to get it to Stephen Maddox, that fish needs to be dead. Kill that fish immediately. Kill it. Drive an ice pick through its brain, because it is illegal to transport live fish in Massachusetts. Note to the wise.
Wow. I wonder if the Massachusetts Bass Federation knows about this. I mean, that is the quackiest law or regulation I've ever heard in my life.
Isn't that a squirrely one? That's
wouldn't they want to keep fish that size alive so they could be released? I mean, come on, Massachusetts.
Walter Balonis, where are you when we need you?
Goodness gracious.
Back to that public water, private water distinction. Michigan says private water, no record. Minnesota says private water, no record. And they're another one of those states that says you can get a little help in landing your fish, but only if it comes to netting or gaffing. I've never heard of a bass ever being gaffed, but just in case.
That's Minnesota. They're talking about big muskie and big pike. So,
There you go. Missouri, well, we won't even worry about that. Missouri's not that different. Montana. Let's go to Montana for a second, Terry, because in Montana, you can they'll acknowledge a record from private property if public access is allowed. So if you have a lake or pond and it's on your property, but you allow public access, then potentially it could produce a state record. Now, what is allowing public access? Does it mean that everybody who wants to fish has to be let in, or does it mean you can let just your buddy Ken onto the property to catch that state record?
Yeah, I lived in Idaho for 20 years, right next to Montana. I fly fished Montana. I got my butt in trouble many times in Montana when I thought I was on BLM land, and evidently I wasn't, because the truck showed up and escorted us off. Generally, there was a sidearm on the person that was escorting us off. I'm not kidding you. It happened at least 3 times. Yeah. And you're fly fishing a river that is supposedly navigable, and therefore water rights, right? I mean, you own the property, but you don't own the water. But if you're waiting, you're on their property. And I learned that the hard way.
That's squirrely.
If I was in a float tube or a canoe, I would be legal. But because my feet were on the ground, it was considered illegal. Yeah, I got my butt in hot water
folks,
a few times.
Check your state regs. I think it's one of the lessons of this show is check your state regs because your mileage may vary depending on where you live.
Yep.
In New Mexico, waters that are open to the public without charge or fee, they can produce a state record. New York, here's where we go back to a point you were making earlier, Terry, about a club that maybe had some private water but wasn't really doing anything to feed or supplement those fish and make them bigger. In New York, if the fish are being fed or otherwise grown with the intention of breaking a state record, disqualified. That's in New York.
And that's probably the only thing I can't say it about upstate. Upstate New York is, beautiful and I think they cherish, but most of everything that comes out of New York comes out of Manhattan and Long Island. So I actually agree.
It's an interesting rule. There's no other state that has a rule quite like that. In North Dakota, and Terry, you and I got a kick out of this. We were talking about the show before we started. To get a state record, you have to submit a Whopper card application first. I assume you can get those at Burger King.
Exactly. It's yeah. Hey, Wally, want a Whopper? I mean, holy mackerel.
Very, very weird. Very weird. Okay, now we talked a little bit earlier about Louisiana, where the Louisiana Outdoor Writers Association handles and curates and archives their state records. In Ohio, the Outdoor Writers of Ohio handles those state records. And they claim to be the only writers organization that maintains the state's official angling records. Well,
they need to talk to Louisiana.
Exactly.
Yeah. But oh God,
exactly.
His name escapes me. The famous bass writer out of Ohio,
Mark Hicks.
Hicks, yes. I wonder if Hicks has anything to do with this.
I don't know. Mark Hicks is one of the great bass writers of eternity.
All time. Yeah,
all time. And we need to check with Mark on that. But this is a squirrely little rag and a questionable claim.
Because, and the reason is, I guarantee you, the reason is because he wants the story.
No, he wants the cover photo, Terry. He wants the cover photo. Story be damned. He wants the cover photo. But whereas Ohio claims to be the only outdoor writer organization that maintains state angling records, then you got Louisiana claiming that Louisiana Outdoor Writers Association has been doing it since 1940. So it's a grudge match. It's a celebrity death match.
Celebrity death match.
And by the way, the Ohio Record Fish Committee is made up of 5 volunteers, and pay lakes are ineligible. But otherwise, private waters would be okay there.
All right, so let me ask you this. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this. Every single lake in California, at least Southern California, requires you to pay a fee to launch your boat. Is that a pay lake? Is that a pay lake? Like it's well, the last time I went to Castaic, it was $35 to launch my boat.
35?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Wow.
You could get a year pass for like $450, which I mean you did. Because you'd pay it off, quick if you fished it every
15
weekend.
trips. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
First of all, we'll never have to cross that bridge, Terry Batiste.
No.
because that is not a concern in Ohio. But,
or any other state, pretty much, for that matter.
Or any other place in America.
Yeah.
Wow. I fish in Florida. I launched my boat in Florida. The usual launch fee in Florida is this much.
Mm-hmm.
And welcome to America.
Mm-hmm.
Oregon. Let's talk Oregon for just a second, because
where you can't pump your own gas.
That's New Jersey too, by the way.
Oh my
very,
God.
very weird. You can't pump your own gas. In Oregon, it's not like Louisiana or Ohio where you got to go through the Outdoor Writers Association. In Oregon, you have to go through the Oregon Bass and Panfish Club,
which is the second oldest club in the United States, second to the Western Bass Fishing Club
in Seattle.
Western Bass Fishing Club started in 1938, and the Oregon Bass and Panfish Club started in the 40s.
Every time which is very rare for me to get out that far west, but in that Seattle area, I always check to see if I'm going to be close to a Western Bass Club meeting, because I would love to attend. Absolutely would love to attend. Yeah. Have you ever been to one of their meetings?
I have not been to one of their meetings, and I actually lived out there when I lived in Idaho. But yeah, it would be that would be a cool thing to do. And you know, one of the guys that started, well, he didn't start it, but he was one of the early members, is Dick Streeter, who's well known for, you know, he's one of the charter members of the NFLCC.
Yeah, one of the absolute experts in the world of antique tackle.
Heddon, I mean, when it comes to Heddon Lures, it was, Clyde Harbin, right?
Yes.
Lived in Arkansas, if I'm not mistaken. But Harbin was the other one that started the NFLCC. Mr. Bass, or the Bass Man.
Yeah, NFLCC, of course, is the National Fishing Lure Collectors Club.
Yep.
And if you ever have a chance to go to one of their meetings, whether it's national or regional, I hope you'll take a chance to do that, because it's well worth your time. You're going to learn more about the history of the sport than you ever imagined. You're going to get a greater appreciation of the developments in the sport through the decades than you will anywhere else. It's a phenomenal experience.
Yeah.
Pennsylvania says private waters. No dice.
No.
Can't be a record for private waters. South Carolina, Terry, has an interesting reg. They say the tackle must be standard and available commercially.
So does that mean a custom rod takes you out of it?
By letter of the rule, I say a custom rod, no record. But I don't think that's probably what they intended to do. I bet you they would make an exception there and say, well, you know, the blank was available commercially and the guides were commercially available and blah, 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 blah. I bet you they'd fast talk their way around that real fast. But what about what about a homemade bait? Is that, you know, available commercially? I don't know.
That's a good question. And
South Carolina, get on those rules. Come on. Get in line.
Tighten them up. Let's not
Texas.
give any lawyers any more money than they deserve.
Exactly. Texas has a rule that has me thinking well into the future of record chasing. Texas has a rule that says the fish must not have contained anything, including electronics or other tagging devices, to assist in locating the fish.
Or diver's weights?
What? Hold it. That's the Sandy DeFresco show. When you folks see a show titled DeFresco, jump on that.
It has nothing to do with food. Culinary experiences.
Not at all. But no, you know, this thing about electronics or tagging devices, you know, we've already seen a few eBay entries, not many, but just a couple, where what you're bidding on is what someone says is a chance at a world record largemouth bass. I remember one
I am
coming
not-
out of South Carolina or Georgia a few years ago saying that this guy had seen a world record largemouth bass. Now, color me beyond skeptical. Beyond skeptical. And I called these people, I contacted these people, I engaged with them through email and so forth, and they're absolutely full of it. But think about it. That's the next step. That's the next step, not only in Boone and Crockett and Pope and Young, but also in bass fishing. Somebody who thinks they've got a world record or a world-class fish, and they've got a tracking device in it.
How did they get it there?
They caught it when it was 18 pounds.
And so
Let's
what?
imagine
You
for a
go up-
moment. Let's imagine for a moment that somebody put a tracking device in Dottie when Dottie was 19 and change.
Okay.
What would it be worth to somebody with almost unlimited funds to go and chase that fish 2-3 years later when it's almost certainly record class?
Yeah. No, you got a point. I mean, you
It's
could
even
trap
more-
you could trap a deer or an antelope or an elk.
I think it's even more problematic in the world of deer hunting, where trail cameras can show you where that animal was just days earlier and give you a good idea of how big the rack on that animal was. In a bass, it's problematic. Maybe somebody caught a bass when it was 18 pounds. 2 years later, you don't know if that bass has declined or increased in weight because you don't know where that bass was age-wise and so forth.
Right.
But this is my concern about where some of these records are going to go, is that eBay is going to take them over. But that Texas Assist record is interesting. Utah says private waters. No.
Nope.
Vermont probably doesn't have a world of fresh waters to fish and exploit the state records in, but they have a quirky rule, and I'll quote it here. The body of water where the fish was caught must be listed. I have no idea what that means.
What does that mean? I mean, I would hope. I mean, that rule probably came from the 40s. Back when they had named bodies of water or something like that. Is the only thing I could think of.
Yeah, I'm guessing by listed they probably mean it's public, but I don't know that. I'm just guessing. Virginia says no to public waters. Wyoming says no to public waters. And that kind of takes us to some of the...
No. Why you had that wrong. Wyoming says no to private waters.
I'm sorry,
public.
no to private waters, yeah. I should have said private waters.
Public waters, you can't have a record.
That would be bad, wouldn't it? That would be terrible.
Yeah, because there'd be no records.
No records. And now let's get back to some of the big record-keeping organizations out there, and let's talk IGFA, because usually when people talk about having a world record, they're talking about being recognized by IGFA, the International Game Fish Association, and IGFA's got a few little quirky records that can definitely trip people up, and one of them has to do with what they call eligible waters, Terry. They say any world fresh water except private club or fish hatchery waters or private ponds not accessible for angling by the general public. Anything else is going to be fine, so it's got to be public water. Fee waters and ponds for angling by permit to the public are allowed. So if you can pay to get in, it's weird. They say fee waters are okay, but they say club waters are not okay. That seems like a distinction without a difference to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ironically, the last word in this eligible waters provision of their rules is inquire.
What?
Inquire. That means they're going to decide on a case-by-case basis. But they don't want to say that. It's going to be a
Here you get
case
the
by
lawyers
case
involved
decision.
in it again. It's legalese BS.
Hey, as a recovering attorney myself, I agree with you. IGFA rules, and this is pretty standard. Anybody seeking a record out there needs to be aware of this. IGFA rules say more than one person involved in subduing the fish will disqualify the catch, except for help in netting, gaffing, beaching, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So letting somebody else handle the rod for a moment is probably going to be a no-go. Again, they don't allow you to use a powerized reel. No electric reels, which are common devices for the handicapped and so forth. But that's about it on the quirky regs thing that people need to be aware of out there.
Yeah, but and we've talked about this in the past. They also have a rule regarding the number of hooks.
They do, and they've softened that rule a bit in recent years. I believe there used to be a rule against 3 treble hooks on a single lure.
All right,
they have
so now
softened that.
All right, so let me pose this question. Back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, I was fishing a lot with Jerry Rago.
Jerry Rago, one of the great designers, famed for the Rago rat and so forth, also has worked for a number of different companies through the years.
Yeah,
Genius in lure design.
The generic trout is the bait that put him on the map. Of course, all the big fish that he was catching back in the late 90s and early 2000s, all even through the 2010s. And we were trolling what we called the spreader rig, which essentially is an Alabama rig. And yeah, and so, and there's no doubt in my mind that Jerry was going for a world record. And we would take these large umbrella rigs, ocean umbrella rigs, that had it was a cross, big weight in the center, usually 2.5 ounces, big cross with stainless steel wire that was 3/16 of an inch in diameter. I don't know what gauge it was. And we would cut 2 opposing arms off, so we just had a straight bar. Spreader, that's why we called it a spreader rig. And we would put 2 generic trout on it, which had only 2 treble hooks apiece on them. But is that whole contraption considered one lure? Which would then take it above 3 treble hooks. It would be 4 treble hooks. And so if he was to catch the world record back then and had to divulge what he caught the fish on, would IGFA accept it? Probably not.
That's a great question because
I never thought of this until just now.
First of all, there are all kinds of hook rules at IGFA.
Yeah.
And dangling or swinging hooks are prohibited.
Yep.
And it's without trying to go into it very deeply here. You need to search the IGFA regs with regard to hooks because that's probably their most extensive area. That's probably where they dive in with the greatest detail because that's where they have the most concern.
But it mainly has to do with marlin fishing, billfish, right?
Right.
Billfish.
Yeah. Again, they're not that concerned with freshwater fishing.
Yeah.
Because they consider most freshwater fishing to be done with single hooks and double treble hooks, maybe 3 treble hooks.
Yeah.
But,
so what if someone catches a world record on an Edo Vision 110? It's got 3 trebles on it. So is
that's legal now?
So it is legal now. Okay. All right.
It is legal now. I the way I read the regs, Terry, that fish would be legal now. But yeah, for something like an Alabama rig, well, first you need to search your state regs with an Alabama rig. and make sure you're
Absolutely.
not above the hook regs there.
Yep.
But second, you need to take a look at the IGFA regs because they get very specific, very detailed. I don't want to go into those too much, only because I don't want to mislead anybody in our audience and let them think that it might be okay when in fact IGFA is going to make a different interpretation on their own regs.
Yeah, and I mean, the only thing that we can tell people listening to us right now is to get on IGFA, download the regulations, and know them by heart. That's the only thing we can do. I mean, you have to be able to read them and interpret them.
If you think you're going to catch a record on a jig, or you're a guy who doesn't fish an Alabama rig or doesn't fish a rig with multiple hooks on it, you probably don't have anything to worry about.
No.
Probably don't have anything to worry about at all. But if you're a guy who's going to be fishing something that's out of the norm, or that might have more than 3 treble hooks on it, or that might have more than 2 single hooks on it, then
what about a guy that's using braid and putting a Top Shot, a mono or a fluorocarbon on it? I mean,
I think you're going to be okay there.
But they're going to go to the braid as the heaviest braking strength, not the leader. I don't know. I mean,
that's true, but unless you're concerned about a line class record, I wouldn't worry about that. And I'm gonna show my colors here and say if you're going after a line class record, who cares? But kind of an all tackle.
Go
guy
big or go home is Ken's motto.
Let's go all tackle or let's go home. But if you're interested in a line class record, obviously you need to take a look at that sort of thing too, and the length of your leader and so forth. But
Right.
if you're interested in all tackle, I think you'd be okay with most of that stuff. Because I looked at that just today.
So what about the last quirky IGFA record? Or requirement?
And that's a great one. The bounties. My friends at Hale Lures, Stanley Jigs, they put out a promotion a few years ago, just a couple of years ago, putting a bounty on the world record largemouth bass, saying that if it was caught on a Stanley jig or a Hale lure, they would pay off X $1,000. And they quickly got a note from IGFA saying that any fish caught in pursuit of a bounty would not be eligible for IGFA record status, which I thought was really interesting because in looking over their regs, I didn't see that provision. I didn't see that.
Interesting.
Now, it may be there, or it may be part of their very loose sportsmanship clause. But that's very interesting because there have been a number of bounties on world record bass through the years. And we're going to do a show on that at some point. But that would be an interesting catch-22. An interesting catch-22, Terry, because, to break the world record, you have to receive acknowledgement and authorization from IGFA. But if they're not going to give it because there's a bounty behind it, then entering the contest to win the bounty means you're prohibited from winning the bounty.
Which means the $1 million fish is a farce.
Well, I wouldn't say that, because I think the fish is worth $1 million, irrespective of the bounties, because of its value to the marketplace and the media. I think that if you or I caught the fish, we would be able to parlay it into 7 figures.
So if the contest is what you're saying is that if the contest is up or not up, but provided prior to you catching the fish and you catch it and you accept the prize, you're DQ'd from IGFA record. But if you catch the fish and after the fact turn it into a marketing deal that gives you hundreds of thousands of dollars, let's say, that's okay? Is that how you read it?
Well,
you haven't even read it because it's not in their book.
Right. First of all, that's right. You're right. Second of all, I would say that if I catch a First of all, if I catch, let's throw it out there, a 23-pound largemouth bass
Never
that
happened.
clearly exceeds Carita and Perry, and clearly would be recognized by IGFA under other circumstances, then whether or not I accept a bounty, that fish is going to be regarded by the bass fishing community as a new world record. I think
Right.
IGFA would fail to recognize that fish at its peril. They would be in a world of trouble by not recognizing that fish. They would be disregarded. They would be discredited. They would be in disrepute by not recognizing that fish.
Yeah, and I think the same could be said about the Carita fish, is that everybody with half a brain cell recognizes the Carita fish as the world record. They don't see Carita.
Battisti continues to tease future episodes, folks. Watch out for what Terry says. We're going to take a deep dive on these other shows. Don't let him distract you.
Sorry.
Yeah, the Carita fish. Yeah, I think that should be the record too. But we won't go into that now. But
No.
yeah, I think that 22.4 is the magic number, whether we like it or not, whether we personally recognize it or not. 22.4 is the magic number.
22.
That's the
22,
number you have to beat.
22.5 is 22.5.6 is the magic number, because it's going to be 2.5 ounces bigger than the current world record if the world record is under 25 pounds. That is what the actual stipulations are from IGFA. You got it.
I was
right
thinking
there.
you had to beat it by 4 ounces, but
It's 2.5
we
ounces.
won't even worry about that. I think that the bottom line is that if I go out and catch a 23-pound bass, that's the world record. That's what the bass fishing community is going to care about.
I'm so sorry, Mac.
That is what the bass fishing, that is what the Big Bass podcast is going to care
It's
about.
all about. Yep.
And it's all about the Big Bass podcast. By the way, folks, we are the official podcast of Big Bass. And you know what, Terry?
Yep.
I think that is a wrap for
Yep.
this episode of the Big Bass podcast. I'm Ken Duke, on behalf of Terry Battisti, my partner, and our producer, engineer, and director, my other partner, our other partner, Nathan Benson. I want to thank you for joining us. We sincerely, I mean it, hope you enjoyed the program. If you did, please rate it, share it, review it. I hear that's important. Anything you can do to help us spread the word and grow our audience is much, much appreciated. We do this show because we love it. We love the sport. We love its history. But we also love your support and our audience support. So if you're watching on YouTube, on our website, however you're watching it, rate it. Tell us what we can do better. Get in contact with us. Our email addresses are ken@thebigbasspodcast.com, terry@thebigbasspodcast.com, or nathan@thebigbasspodcast.com. And come on back next week. We're going to have another show for you next week. I can't tell you exactly what it's about next time because we're recording in a different order maybe than sometimes we're showing them. But we will be back, and it's going to be about a big bass that is going to contain a lot of information that you did not have before and that you cannot find anywhere else. So we look forward to that one, and look forward to your joining us. Thanks a lot.